So we continue. I'll start now. 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly.
So said he, "Let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him." After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him,
bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?" But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried."
To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go."
Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix. When I was at Jerusalem, the chief priest and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him.
I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I had supposed.
Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar.
Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," said he, "you will hear him." So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in, and Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all who are present with us,
You see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer? But I found that he had done nothing deserving of death. As he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him."
Okay, so this is an interesting position here because we have a change in Roman leadership. Paul had been held for 2 years under Felix, and he was succeeded by Porticus Festus. In desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Felix's cruelty, coupled with his accessibility to bribes, led to a great increase of crime in Judea. During that time period, the last 2 years was Paul in prison. There were several uprisings among the Jews against Roman control. And Felix had put them down quite brutally, to the point that the Sanhedrin had sent a letter to Nero to complain about it. So Porticus Festus succeeded him as procurator of Judea. And after 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So we had to think that basically he was touring around, looking at what he had control of, had never been there, and then he ends up in Jerusalem. So these are our two players. We have a couple players that are very important, Felix Porcius, and there are still statues of Governor Felix left available, and we can see the two of them that are the prime players in this dialogue. Now, Marcus Antonius Felix was originally a slave from Cilicia, Paul's home province, but had gained freedom thanks to his brother Marcus Antonius Paulus, was a freedman well liked by Caesar Claudius. As Antonius Felix's political fortunes rose, so did his reputation for corruption, cruelty, and lust. Felix governed Judea from 52 AD to 60 AD with the power of the king, but the mind of a slave, according to the Roman historian Tacitus. 2 years after Paul's imprisonment in Caesarea, the Roman governor Antonius Felix crushed an uprising of the Jews with such brutality that the Jewish Sanhedrin complained bitterly to Rome, and as a result, Felix was recalled to Rome, and Porticus was appointed as governor of Judea. He was saved from execution by his intercession of his brother as well. Now, Festus Porticus, he was procurator of Judea from 60 to 62 CE, very short time period, only 2 years after Felix, according to Josephus. Although he was more just than his predecessor, he could not allay the intense bitterness of feelings among the Jews, caused briefly by their being slighted in the affair of Caesarea. Then King Agrippa II, in order to be able to oversee the court of the temple, erected a high wall in the former Hasmonean castle. The Jews, in turn, erected a higher wall to cut off his view. So essentially, the temple, there was a military establishment, Roman establishment, located immediately adjacent to the temple. And the Jews didn't like him being able to see down into the temple courtyard, so they built a wall. It's kind of a funny dichotomy. One builds one, one's builds another. They built a higher wall to cut off his view. Festus, however, for military reasons, would not allow this to stand, but he was just enough to permit the Jews to send an ambassador to appeal against his decision to Nero, who decided in their favor. Festus died after a short term of office and was succeeded by Albinus. Now, by this time, Paul was gone because it was under Festus that he was taken to Rome. Now, the other two players that we have were Bernice and Herod Agrippa II. Now, Bernice is Herod Agrippa II's sister. And unfortunately, like most Romans of that time period, they were not indisposed to having affairs with their intimate relatives. In other words, he was known to have an affair with his sister. Herod Agrippa II, officially called Marcus Julius Agrippa, and sometimes shortened to just Agrippa, was the last ruler from the Herodian dynasty, reigning over the territories outside of Judea as a Roman client. Agrippa II fled Jerusalem in 66 during the Jewish uprising and supported the Roman side of the First Jewish-Roman War. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, repeats the gossip that Agrippa lived in an incestuous relationship with his sister Bernice. Agrippa expended large sums of money in beautifying Jerusalem. His partiality for the latter rendered him unpopular among his subjects, and his capricious manner in which he appointed and disposed high priests made him highly disliked. So he was responsible for an area rather than just Judea. He was responsible for a very large area, but he happened to like Jerusalem, and he poured a huge amount of money into the temple. If you remember from Nehemiah and Ezra, the temple was so small that when the people came back from Babylon, they cried about how small it was compared to the first temple. But the second temple was, Herod made it a beautiful, spacious area, as what is left today, the foundation of the temple. Of course, the western wall is the only actual remaining portion that is visible. The rest is mostly would have been underground. So if we look, we are going to look at this same area here. We're talking again on the map from Jerusalem to Caesarea. And this is the area where this whole chapter is involved. Now, it's interesting to note when we look at the claims made, we have the same type of action going on in Acts 23 and again in Acts 25. And Acts 23 says, "Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near." And then in Acts 25, "And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they planned an ambush to kill him on the way." It's interesting to speculate whether Festus actually knew about it. But there are some important things we need to think about. Let the men of authority go down. So this is Festus saying, let the men of authority. Now, it's interesting because the men of authority that were picked were all Sadducees. There were obviously the Pharisees in the earlier chapter talked about the fact they found no fault in him. And he said, if there's anything wrong, let them bring charges. So he was going to let them bring his charges before him. And here, the Festus took a seat on the tribunal, and the picture to the right of your screen is what it would have looked like. With Paul was brought and stood in front of him, basically where this individual is holding his hand out. And then they stood around him bringing serious charges. So you can visualize this very clearly that Paul would have been standing in front of Festus. The Jews would have been standing around making the charges against him. And they made many serious charges, but they had no proof for any of the charges that they brought. And it's interesting when we consider this. Paul is being charged in a Roman court as his first defense. It's sort of like going to the court here, and then you appeal your case, and then you go to the appeals court, and then you appeal a case, and you go to the Supreme Court. And the Roman court system was set up that ours was based on how they ran it. When you appealed, you went to a higher body, is what we're going to see here when Agrippa shows up. And then he appeals, and he's taken directly to Caesar to be tried. So Paul's defense was interesting. He made 3 points of defense. First, that neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar. So he is putting on a three-pronged defense, and his three-pronged defense was very specific. In the law of the Jews, he's talking about the Torah. He's talking about the ordinances, the statutes, the oral Torah. So he really, this was what was considered the laws of the Jews. And he said, I have done nothing against them, so they don't have a right to say I have. And then he talked about the temple. Well, what was the defense for the temple? What could they charge him with? Well, According to the Talmud, they could charge him with the sanctity of the temple. How did he profane the temple itself? The laws of the temple shekel coin. Now, if you remember, we hear about this of giving coins in the temple when you came up to it, and you were required to make a temple donation. As you remember, Jesus had Peter go get the shekel from the fish's mouth, and if you look at early Judean coins, it actually has a picture of a menorah on the back side of it that was used to pay the temple price, half shekel. The other thing were the laws of gifts to the priesthood. So there was a specific giving that was required if you went to the temple, and those gifts to the priesthood. If you remember, when we talk about the different offerings that are given in Leviticus, they talk about which parts the priest got to eat, right? So they bring a lamb that was sacrificed. Part of it was a ram. Part of it was sacrificed. Part of it was given to the priest. The other thing was the laws of the temple workers, right? There were specific things that related to how the temple workers. And Paul's saying, I didn't do any of things. And finally, there was law specifically to the temple building, how the building was treated, what areas you were allowed to go in. And remember, they made the charge against him that he brought a Greek, because you had the section of the Temple Mount that was for non-Jews to the Gentile court, that they had to stay there. They made the charge that he just disregarded that. And finally, you have two other ones, the laws of temple prayers. There are specific prayers that are recorded to this day that are said in the temple, and some of them we use, the Amidah, etc., in our modern services. But there were specific laws, and finally, laws of temple offerings. So there's a third offering that's given. You had the priest, the temple, the temple workers, and of course the regular temple offerings, the grain offerings, etc. And he's claiming, I did everything according to what the temple law required. And then he makes his third prong of his defense against Caesar. And in Roman law, the right to vote in Roman assemblies and elections was required of all citizens. If you were a citizen, you were required to vote. And Paul is saying he did not break that. You have the right to hold office and access public office. In other words, that is one of the reasons why he called on the right to go to be tried in front of Caesar. The right of a Roman citizen to make contracts and hold property as a Roman citizen. We know that Paul's family was very well off. We know that he was a tent maker. We know, so he had a contract, more than likely, with whomever he made tents for and who he sold tents to. We know that he worked for the couple, Agrippa and, help me out here, Gordon. Who's the woman that he worked for? My brain fails me on it. I'll remember. You're muted.
Aquila and Priscilla.
Aquila and Priscilla. That's who I was thinking of. He made tents for them. So he probably had a contract with them for his work. And that was a typical thing when you work, that you had a contract, much like union contracts today. He has a right to have a lawful marriage and to have children underneath such marriage become Roman citizens automatically. Just like in the United States, if you're born in the United States, you're automatically a U.S. citizen. They had the same rule in Rome. Now, we don't have any discussion about Paul being married, which is, I find to be an interesting thing, because he was at the time when Stephen was stoned, Paul would have been probably been married by 10 years by then. But we have no discussion on that, and so we do not know if he instead just stayed celibate his whole life. The right to legal rights of paterfamilias of the family. In other words, he again had the right to call on Roman law in regard to how his family was treated. And finally, they have the right of life and death over their dependents. If you were an individual who was a Roman citizen, you had the right to have your children put to death. You had a right to have your wife put to death. If you're a male, if you remember, when we talked about Herod, one of the things was he had several of his wives put to death, right? And his kids. Well, that was his right as a Roman citizen. So he goes and Festus says, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried on these charges before me? It's interesting to wonder if Festus knew of the plot of murder to murder Paul or not. If he did know, then he knowingly asked Paul to walk into an ambush and be murdered. If he did not know, then he merely thought that this would please the religious leaders to have the trial in Jerusalem. He would still be the one holding the court, right? The same person holding the court, but it would give the Jews of the Sanhedrin a chance to ambush him on the way. But it's an interesting thought. Did he know about it? Did they pay him off? It was common to pay off at that time. But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. It was the right of every Roman citizen to have his case heard before Caesar himself. After his initial trial and appeals failed to reach a satisfactory decision. This was, in effect, an appeal to the Supreme Court of the Roman Empire. So Paul knew his rights as a citizen, and he claimed those rights. So here's the problem that arises. I appeal to Caesar. Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. So they showed up with great pomp and circumstances, because remember, Festus only controlled Judea itself and Jerusalem. Festus controlled, Agrippa controlled the whole area around there. So he showed up with his sister, and they greeted, and they stayed on there many days, and Festus led Paul's case before the king. Now we're going to look at that in great detail, Paul's defense in the next chapter. But the problems that arose from doing this is that Festus answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. There is a man left prisoner by Felix. The Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation. So this is what he's telling Agrippa. And it's interesting because he's already made the declaration that he's going to send him to Caesar. But now he's got a huge problem. And the problem is this. I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing to write my lord about him. Well, he's now got himself in a bind because he's agreed to send him to Caesar. Rather than simply discharge him and say, you have done nothing wrong, which was his right as the ruler of Judea, he is now saying, okay, I'll pass you on to Caesar. I don't want to make that. But here's the problem. If he sends him with a false charge or sends him without a charge, as an individual, if Paul goes to Caesar and Caesar says, hey, there's nothing wrong with this guy, and these are false charges, or you did not send a charge along with him, then the individual was responsible to receive the punishment of it. And that's why he's going, I cannot do this. And I found it interesting that when he laid this out to Agrippa, Festus said, King Agrippa and all who present to us, you see this matter about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting he not live any longer. But I found he had done nothing deserving of death. Well, here's the problem. The whole Jewish people. It wasn't obviously the whole Jewish people, but he is overstating his case, right? Trying to get Agrippa to give him some excuse to send him on. only a very small section of the Sanhedrin. And when they, if you remember, he called up the chief priests and certain people to make their claim against him. So his whole claim was false in the start of it, because he said it happened both in Jerusalem and here. And yes, they wanted him to be killed. That part was correct, but the rest was not. So he says, therefore, I have brought him before you, and especially you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. So he's ran into this problem. He's ran into the problem that he has nothing to file as a complaint, right? And as I stated, he cannot get away from that. It seems unreasonable to me not to indicate the charges against him. So in the next chapter, we're going to look at Paul's discussion of his defense. We're coming down to the last 3 chapters of Acts. As a matter of fact, in 2 of the chapters, it's all about the journey. But Paul spent 2 years here, and during this time frame, he had a chance, as Gordon said last week, to send many letters. And again, when he was in Rome, he again sent many letters. And it is interesting how God works, because he was allowed to have people come and go while he was there. It wasn't like he was in a prison cell. He was being in, we would call it house arrest, right? He wasn't allowed to go anywhere. He was kept in the Roman building there, but people were allowed to meet him, and they came and went. And here we find that Festus has walked himself right into a trap, and he's looking for a way out from this king. So the last 3 chapters of Acts are going to be shorter ones, including this one. And the next one, we're going to hear about the argument that Paul puts forth to Festus and Agrippa and of course Bernice. So it's kind of a short one tonight, but we look forward to the argument next week. And then our last 2 are about the journey to Rome and then Paul's time in Rome. So does anybody have any questions about tonight? I think I pretty much covered everything about what was in this chapter. It's interesting when we study Acts that we you wonder, why do they put certain things in the Bible? Do we really? Next week, no, 2 weeks, it is literally about the journey, about going from this island to that island to that island to a shipwreck to little steps. But everything is written down for a reason. And when we look at it, we have to look at what is the outcome? What was the lesson that we're to learn from it? And we look at the lesson here from Acts. It's a lesson that Paul is using all of his knowledge and all of the gifts that God has given him to protect him, but also allows him to spend more time sharing with all of the churches that he started. And that's what we have to do. No matter what position we're in, God gives us a chance to reach out to other people, and that's what we have to remember in our lives. Reach out to other people. Well, let's close with a word of prayer tonight. And I want to thank everybody for joining us, and looking forward to see you on Shabbat. Well, Friday night, actually, first. Our dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for allowing us to open this book of Acts, and as we look at Paul's trials and the tribulation he went through, and how his faith remained strong and committed to you to the very end. May we also have that strength and commitment till the very end. For these things, I thank you in the name of your Son, Yeshua. Amen.